Hello and welcome to this edition of Trash to Track. In this edition we're going to be trying to restore this battered Bachmann Great Western 56XX tank, which, looking at it, has had a pretty hard life. The footsteps there are bent, the cab roof and windows are missing, the copper cap to its chimney is missing, it's missing buffers, and the handrails are pretty much bent out of shape. I did do the battery test on this and it was a stuttery runner, so we're going to have to do a full service. First off, I'm going to unscrew these two screws to remove the chassis from the body. I've also got to remove these broken NEM coupler pockets that fling off into the ether and will get hoovered up later on. I'm unsure as to what chassis this model is on, as these models date from the Airfix time and this could either be split chassis or DCC ready. Using a small Phillips screwdriver, I just undo the two retaining screws, and again with the trusty plastic tub to keep all the bits in, remove them both, and then this should separate the body from the chassis. Removing the chassis shows us now that it's actually one of the later models and it is actually DCC ready. The body shell itself isn't too bad, but there is a couple of broken bits on it that will need repair later on. I'm going to remove this small additional weight piece and put the decoder where that was later on when we reassemble the model. As you can see, the lubricant that Bachmann used has gone hard, so this could attribute to the poor running. The pickups are not exactly in line with the wheels either, and these brake blocks on this side are all twisted out of shape, so these will need to be remedied as well. Overall, it's not in too bad condition. I've seen a lot worse. What we're going to do now is we're going to remove this base plate of the chassis using the correct size small Phillips screwdriver and remove the 3 screws that hold it on. There's one screw down in a deep recess and then there's 2 others, and once removed the chassis base plate will fall off and away, but it is attached to the frame with the wires for the pickups. By doing this, this releases the wheels and I will clean them independently later on. I also removed these sprung bearings that bear down on the wheels to aid pickup, as these will need re-lubricating and cleaning as well. Again, inside there is a lot of hardened grease, so we're going to have to remove all this, and I'm hoping I don't have to remove the motor. There's not too much in the way of hair and crud all over this. It's actually quite clean. It just looks like the body shell's taken a battering during its lifetime. Using cotton bud and meths, I just gently wipe away all the hardened grease and we'll reapply grease later on. Whilst the chassis base plate is off, I realign and clean up all the pickups. The brake blocks that were broken have actually split from the plastic on the chassis, so I'm going to apply a small amount of super glue into the split and then hold them back into position and hope this holds them. Otherwise it's going to be quite tricky to glue them back on. This actually works quite well, and after a few seconds they dry solid and they're back in their original positions. Also missing off the rear of the base plate is a sanding pipe from the sandbox. I couldn't get the snapped off piece of wire out, so I've drilled a fresh hole and will make a new sanding pipe out of some brass rod. By drilling out a 1mm hole, I use this 1mm brass rod and just bend it to shape. I will then super glue this in, and once dry paint it black, and hopefully you'll never know it's been repaired. Once bent to shape, I apply a little bit of super glue and then hold it in place and wait for it to dry. Whilst the glue is drying, I'm going to turn my attention to the wheel sets. Using a cocktail stick, I remove the dust and fluff that has gathered around the ends of the axles on the pony truck, and also use a cotton bud dipped in meths to remove the crud. to remove the crud that's built up in the corners. Generally speaking, the wheel sets aren't too bad. They are relatively clean compared to ones I've worked on in the past. Once I've finished cleaning this pony wheel, I turn my attention to the driving wheels, and I use my method of a cotton bud with meths and a fiberglass pencil to just shine up the wheel surfaces to ensure good electrical contact. Once all the wheel treads are clean, I notice that there's still some dust and fluff that's dry within the wheel spokes. So I nip inside and borrow the wife's toothbrush again, as she doesn't seem to notice, and I'm going to just use this dry and remove all the fluff etc. that's within the wheel spokes. This comes off quite easily, as I've said before, there's no lubrication on these wheels that makes the dirt stick. Now I'm going to also clean up these bearing pieces as well, again using a cotton bud and meth just to remove any of the lingering lubrication that Bachmann applied many years ago. Then we can start reassembling the chassis and the wheels back together. This model has two of these sprung bearings, one for the main centre drive wheel and one for the pony truck on the rear. Before I put the wheels back in, I'm just going to remove the last of the lubrication and then reapply the driving wheels. These will only go in one way so that the cogs mesh correctly with the motor. Now they're sitting in place, I'm going to give them a lubrication with some modelling oil and then some silicone grease on the main driving gear to prevent any wear and tear with metal upon metal. It has been many years since this engine's had any sort of lubrication on it, so hopefully it will improve running, as when I did the battery test on this, the running was extremely jittery and wasn't very good at all. This is the normal silicone grease I've used on all my rebuilds that comes from Eileen's Emporium, and using a cocktail stick I put a liberal amount on the cog and on the axle just so that when it beds in it all runs nicely. Now all the lubrication's done, I gently put the base plate back on, making sure that the pickups are all in line with the wheels and that everything clips in place nicely and we do not trap any wires. The homemade sanding pipe I made is actually now running on the wheel tread, so this will need trimming off later on. Now that the wheels and chassis plate are all back attached, I'm going to apply some modelling oil to the cogs from the drive worm gear and on the worm gear and bearing on the motor itself. You don't need much lubrication, as over lubrication will only make the oil splash around and you will create more work for yourself in tidying it up later. I'm also going to put some more of this silicone grease on the worm gear of the motor itself so it spreads through the drivetrain and keeps it nice and lubricated for future use. I find it easy applying this with a cocktail stick. Anything bigger or metallic and you may end up ruining the plastic gears. Doing the quick battery test, it now seems to be running a lot better, although it's still not 100% and I've got a feeling my battery might be dying. So I put it on this length of track and then connect a controller to it just to see if my battery's dying, and indeed it does seem like it is, as when I test it with a controller it runs a lot better. Now the chassis seems to be running well, I'm going to give it a couple of minutes running in each direction on these backrest saddles just to bed the cogs and lubrication in and then clean off any excess before I attempt a repair of the body shell. As you can see, it is running beautiful now and it is all ready for a new DCC decoder. I'm just going to snip that over-lengthed sandpipe off and you can see it spring back into the place where it should be. I will then touch this up with black paint while I work on the body shell. I am pleased with how this has come out, as before it was extremely jittery and I was doubtful whether this was going to run properly at all. In fact, its running qualities when I first tested it led me to believe that it was actually a split chassis model and not one of the newer DCC fitted ones. I just added a slight bit more of oil there on the worm gear to spread through and everything seems to be running and bedding in quite nicely. I'm also going to add a slight bit of lubrication to the coupling rods and then we're about done with the chassis rebuild. The body shell is covered in a thick layer of dust and is missing some parts, so my local model shop Trains For You has actually ordered some parts from the Bachmann spares websites for me and they've arrived and I've collected them. The parts that were missing were the copper cap chimney and the boiler backhead. The original backhead has snapped off in the chassis, so using my Dremel and a 1mm drill bit I drill out the holes where the old connecting pins were, and as you can see there, the old connecting pin plastic is stuck to the drill bit. This will allow me to just simply slot in the new boiler backhead into the original's place. Once this was done, I did secure it in place with a small amount of super glue just to hold it firm. Now we're going to tackle the body shell and try and remove all this dust. Initially I tried my wife's toothbrush again dry, but it didn't seem to shift it very well, so I'm going to have to resort to using some warm soapy water again. This makes me slightly nervous, as when I did this on the Dean goods in the very first Trash to Track, it actually affected the paintwork and removed a lot of it. Before I go into washing it, I'm going to mend these small details that we saw that were broken at the start, just so that none of them fly off into the water and I lose them. This pipe work on the back of the cab here is easy to replace. It was hanging on by a small thread of plastic, and a slight bit of super glue has now held it back into place where it should be. I also fixed the body side cab steps that are also broke. These have split, and applying a small amount of super glue into the hole, like I did with the brake blocks, will then secure it in place nice and firmly. I couldn't get any replacement buffers from Bachmann, so I'm going to look through my spare buffers to see if I've got any that match the front two. I've got quite a few that I've amassed over the years, and I'm sure if I look hard enough I'll be able to find some. Sure enough, I find an exact match for the front buffer. I think these are off an old Great Western pannier tank that I had many years ago, so there should be another one in here. I'm also going to look through my stash of buffer beam pipes to replace the missing vacuum pipes off the front and rear of the loco. I pull out a few and I will pick the best fit ones and we'll glue these on later. Now it's time to wash the body, now the glue is completely dried. I've got to work quickly as the day's getting on and my wife's going to need her toothbrush soon. I can see that there's quite an amount of dust on this, so getting some warm soapy water, I'm going to gently wash this body shell down and hope for the best that the paint isn't affected. Gently scrubbing the body shell, and you'll notice I've also removed the front handrails as these were bent beyond repair, so I will fashion a new set later on. But gently washing the body shell with a toothbrush removes all the stuck on grime and dust that was stuck to this body shell. I'll now leave this overnight to dry, and hopefully in the morning when we come back it will look nice and shiny and we can get on with detailing and replacing all the missing parts. After washing, I gently blot off all the excess water and then we'll leave it to dry thoroughly overnight before tackling the rest of it. It's not come up too bad and the paintwork looks like it's survived the wash. I just use a quick cotton bud there just to get any bubbles out that are trapped underneath the boiler casing. One of the things that was missing on the body shell was a sandbox off one side, and these are not available as spares, they are actually part of the body shell. So I found this spare one that I had in my detailing parts, and drilling a small hole in it, I'm going to fashion a replacement. It will not be an exact match, but it would be good enough just to replace the part that's missing. There are a couple of holes in this sandbox as it's not from this model, so I use some model filler to cover these holes, and then once left overnight to fully harden, I will sand it down and then give it a coat of black paint. I've just drilled a hole in the bottom ready to take another sanding pipe fashioned from the same 1mm brass rod we used earlier on. Now it's time to fashion some new handrails, and I did this off camera. It took a while to do, but I got there in the end. Having fixed the handrail knobs back into the boiler casing, it's just a simple case of gently sliding this new handrail wire through and hoping that I've got the curvature and bends right on the front. Fashioning the new handrail really was a delicate task and took me well over an hour. That's why I did it off camera. Threading the wire through the handrail knobs, it looks like I've done a pretty good job of replacing this. The original had been cut by the previous owner, so it was too short, and it was also bent to such an extent that it was not repairable. Here I'm just putting the front handrail knob back in the smoke box door and just giving it a good test fit, and then I'll glue it in place from the inside. Using some long nose pliers, it's handy just to push that in home. That doesn't look too bad at all, and neither does this replacement sandbox, which I'll now attach to the rear of the body, again using a small amount of super glue. As I said, it's not an exact replica, but it's better than it not being there at all. Now that glue's drying, I'm going to turn my attention to the chassis again and fit a DCC decoder. Removing the blanking plate, I cannot see a number 1 marked on the PCB, so this is going to be trial and error. Using this Bachmann 36553 decoder that I have spare out of a loco I've sold, I just simply put the 8-pin plug in and then the decoder will sit on top of the motor, like so. I'm going to give this a test and see if it works. This will prove that the decoder is making contact properly and that it is in the right way round. Hey presto, it's working, so we're right on track for this rebuild to be completed very soon. This is the old handrail that I've got left over, and I'm going to cut a small piece off and use this as the sanding pipe for the sandbox we just made. I did this as the hole I drilled in the sanding box was slightly too large for the 1mm wire that I was going to use, so I used this and it was slightly thicker and proved a better, tighter fit. To ensure the decoder doesn't short circuit on the metal chassis, I put a couple of bits of black insulation tape over the chassis frame, and then I will tape the decoder to this, just to keep it out of the way. This is in the space where that removable weight was taken out at the start of the video when I disassembled this model. Just trimming up the masking tape there, that will hold that in place nicely and out of the way, ready for reassembly. I'll just give it a quick test again just to make sure no wires or anything have been trapped, and then that is ready now for reassembly. The footage now is a little bit out of sequence as I've already put the body shell back on the chassis in this instance, but here I'm test fitting the new cab roof, and as you can see, if you look carefully enough, I put the decoder initially behind the boiler backhead, but this didn't work. To fix the cab roof in place, I use some satin varnish from Rail Match. This has the benefit of drying like glue, but doesn't mark the paintwork in any way. And if you should ever need to get in the cab again, it's easily to break the bond. As you can also see, I fitted a driver and fireman into this loco as the cab is pretty open and sparse. So using a cocktail stick, I apply a liberal amount to the edges of the cab sides and then just push the roof and the windows home until it clicks. This was then left to thoroughly dry. Next up, I'm going to apply the new buffers using the same method. Just a small amount of satin varnish on the rear of the loco, and I push the buffers home, and then again, once this is dry, it proves a strong bond without any glue marks that you get from using super glue. Now everything's dry, and like I just said, this bit was a bit out of sequence. So now I'm refitting the body to the chassis, ensuring that I don't trap any of the decoder wires. The chassis and body is quite a snug fit, so you have to go carefully and ensure you don't trap any detail parts or indeed any decoder wires. As you can see there, the decoder wires are sticking out slightly, so using this scriber, I just tuck them in gently and the body shell clips home. It is then refastened using the 2 screws that we took out earlier on. One more test to make sure nothing is broken, and we can reattach the body shell. Once the body shell's been reattached, I'm going to refit the 2 new NEM couplings that I found again in my spares box, and also fit the buffer beam pipes that we got out earlier on, and we should be good to test this model, and we're nearly at the end of this rebuild. Let's remind ourselves on what we started with. This battered Great Western tank was missing its copper cap chimney, its cab roof, it was missing 2 buffers, its handrails were bent and it had no couplings. It was also a very poor runner. There was dust encrusting it, and it was just in a very general bad state. And this is what it looks like now. Almost factory fresh. It really does look really nice. The handrails have been painted black. It's got a new copper cap to its chimney, cab roof, couplings, buffers and buffer beam pipes. I'm glad to have rescued this engine from the scrapyard and returned it to service. We'll now see some shots of it running around the layout, and I'll also show you a close-up inside the cab of the driver and fireman, which I really do think this sets this model off. I didn't go to the extent of replacing the cab side transfers, as I preferred the work-worn look of this loco, and it just harks back to the hard life it had before it entered my hands. Thank you so much for watching. I'll leave you now with some shots of it running around the layout on a goods train and a local passenger train. Until next time, I'll catch you again. Please like, share and subscribe, and there'll be more Trash to Track episodes coming soon.